The moment her SUV rolled through my gate for the last time, I already knew exactly where the wall would go. The metallic groan of hinges woke me before my alarm ever had the chance. That low, dragging sound of steel being forced open echoing across 40 acres of quiet Texas land like it didn't belong there. And for a second, I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, letting the sound settle into something real, something undeniable. Because this wasn't the first time, and deep down I knew it wouldn't be the last unless I did something about it. The early morning air still carried that cool, dusty edge that comes before sunrise, but underneath it I could already smell exhaust drifting in through the open window, thick and out of place, like someone had decided my property was just another stretch of public road. And by the time I pulled on my boots and stepped out onto the porch, gravel crunching under my weight, I caught the tail end of it. A white SUV disappearing past my fence line like it had every right in the world to be there. Like the gate I'd built, paid for, and locked every single night was nothing more than a suggestion, not a boundary, not a line, not mine. And I stood there longer than I should have, jaw tight, watching the dust settle in slow motion behind her tires, because this wasn't about a shortcut anymore. It hadn't been for a while. This was about control, about someone deciding that my land, my gate, my peace were optional, and the worst part was how casually it all happened, like it had been normalized, like the rules just didn't apply if you drove a nice enough car and smiled the right way at the right people. And if you've ever had that feeling, that quiet moment where something small crosses a line and you realize it's not small at all, then you already know what was running through my head right then, because I tried the reasonable route. I'd locked the gate, reinforced the latch, even posted signs clear enough a blind man could read them. Private property, no through access. Bold black letters against fresh white paint. And still, every few days, sometimes every morning, I'd hear that same metal scrape, that same engine hum cutting through land that was supposed to be mine alone. And that's when it clicked, standing there with the smell of gasoline hanging in the air and the sun just starting to bleed over the horizon. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a pattern. And patterns can be studied, measured, and if you're patient enough, they can be stopped, because what she didn't know, what Victoria Hale and her perfectly manicured HOA board didn't understand, was that I wasn't just some guy with a wrench and a lock. I was a civil engineer who'd spent 20 years designing barriers, access points, and systems that controlled who went where and when. And once you understand how movement works, how people rely on convenience without ever questioning it, you start to see opportunities where other people just see problems. And right there, with the taste of dust in my mouth and that empty stretch of land in front of me, I stopped thinking about how to keep her out and started thinking about how to make sure she'd never get through. Again, my name is Ethan Cole. I am 42 years old, and every inch of that land out there past my porch was something I worked for, one project, one contract, one long night at a time. The kind of work that leaves your hands rough and your mind wired even after you shut your eyes. Because for the last 2 decades, I have been building things people do not usually notice unless they fail. Access roads, drainage systems, structural barriers. The quiet infrastructure that decides how water flows, how traffic moves, how boundaries hold. And about 3 years ago, after one too many hotel rooms and too many early mornings staring at job sites that were never really mine, I bought those 40 acres just outside Austin, Texas, not because it was flashy or convenient, but because it was quiet, the kind of quiet you feel in your chest, where the only sounds at sunrise are wind brushing through dry grass and the distant hum of cicadas warming up for the day. And right at the front of that land sits the gate, 12 feet wide, steel frame, reinforced hinges, mounted into limestone posts I set myself. Not decorative, not for show, but functional. Because that gate marks the exact point where public ends and private begins, and I remember the day I installed it, the heat sitting heavy on my shoulders, the smell of cut metal still sharp in the air, telling myself this is it. This is the line. Everything past here is mine to protect, mine to control, and for a while, that was exactly how it worked. The gravel driveway stretched nearly a quarter mile from that gate to my house, curving just enough through the trees that you could not see the place from the road. Which was the whole point: privacy, distance, space to breathe without someone else deciding how close they get. But land does not stay isolated forever, not in Texas, not this close to a growing city. And about 8 months after I moved in, The development started creeping up along the eastern boundary. Survey flags first, then heavy equipment, then rows of houses going up faster than seemed possible, all part of a new subdivision marketed as premium country living, which was ironic considering they carved it straight out of what used to be open ranch land. And that is when I first heard the name Victoria Hale, the woman running the homeowners association before the last house even had a roof, a real estate agent with a reputation for keeping things orderly, which in practice meant she decided what was acceptable and what was not. And at first, she was just a distant presence, something you hear about, but do not deal with. Until one afternoon about 4 months ago, I was out by the fence line checking a drainage ditch after a storm, boots sinking slightly into damp soil, when I heard an engine where there should not have been one, steady, slow, coming from inside my property, and I remember turning, wiping dirt from my hands, and seeing that same kind of white SUV rolling down my driveway like it had always belonged there, sunlight flashing off the windshield, tires pressing fresh tracks into gravel that had only ever known my truck, and when it reached the gate, it did not stop, did not hesitate, just eased right through as if the idea of permission had never even crossed her mind. And that was the first time I saw her clearly, blonde hair pulled back, sunglasses, one hand resting casually on the wheel like she was taking a Sunday drive, and when our eyes met for a split second, there was no confusion, no apology, just that faint, almost polite smile people use when they believe they are in the right. And in that moment, standing there with mud on my boots and the smell of rain still hanging in the air, I realized something that stuck with me long after her car disappeared past the trees. This was not someone making a mistake. This was someone making a decision. Victoria Hale did not introduce herself the way most neighbors would. There was no handshake, no welcome to the area, no attempt at even pretending this was a conversation between equals. Instead, the next time I saw her, she was already stepping out of that white SUV in front of my gate like she owned the ground beneath it, heels clicking softly against the gravel, a clipboard tucked under her arm like it was some kind of badge. And even before she spoke, I could smell that faint mix of expensive perfume and fresh paper, the kind of scent that follows people who spend more time enforcing rules than living by them. And she gave me that same controlled smile I had seen before, the one that never quite reaches the eyes, as if friendliness was just another tool she used when it suited her. "Ethan, right?" she said, like she had already confirmed it somewhere, like my name had been checked off a list, and I nodded slowly, watching her, not because I did not know who she was, but because I wanted to hear how she was going to explain driving through my property like it was a public street. And she did not hesitate, not even for a second. She gestured casually toward the open gate behind her and said, "We have been using this access point to connect to the main road. It cuts about 7 minutes off the drive for residents." And the way she said residents made it clear exactly who she thought mattered in that sentence. And I remember the sound of wind brushing through the dry grass behind me, steady and low, like it was filling in the silence she left hanging. Because she had not asked for permission. She had not even acknowledged that permission might be required. She was simply informing me of a reality she had already decided was true, and I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Not anger, not yet, but something colder, something more precise, the kind of awareness you get when a line has just been crossed and the person standing on the other side has no intention of stepping back. That is private property, I said, keeping my voice level, the words steady, measured, the way you speak when you are used to explaining things to people who should already understand them. And for a brief second her smile paused, just enough to register that she had heard me, but then it came, right back, polished and unmoved. "There was an understanding with the previous owner," she replied, flipping a page on her clipboard like the answer was already written down somewhere official. "Temporary access during development." And that word temporary lingered in the air longer than it should have, because everything about the way she said it suggested she had no intention of treating it that way. And I could hear the faint ticking of her engine cooling behind her, the soft metallic clicks echoing between us, marking time in a conversation that was not really a conversation at all. And that is when I asked the question that matters more than anything in situations like this. Do you have that in writing? And this time, just for a fraction of a second, there it was, a flicker, not uncertainty exactly, but annoyance, like I had introduced a complication she did not feel like dealing with. And she shifted her weight slightly, the gravel crunching under her heel. "We are Finalizing documentation, she said, smooth, practiced, the kind of answer designed to move past details without actually addressing them. And that was the moment it became clear, not just what she was doing, but how she was doing it, because this was not about a legal right. It was about creating the appearance of one, using confidence and repetition until nobody questioned it anymore. And as she turned to leave, already done with the exchange in her mind, she added over her shoulder, "We will make sure everything is aligned soon." Like that was supposed to settle it. Like that was supposed to make me step aside and let it happen. And I stood there listening to the sound of her door closing, the engine starting again, tires rolling across my land like it had already been claimed, and I realized something that shifted the entire situation in my head. She was not asking because she did not think she needed to. And people who think like that do not stop when you tell them no. They stop when the system stops them. And standing there with that realization settling in, I knew this was no longer about a gate. It was about building something she could not simply talk her way through. The next morning, I locked the gate earlier than usual, the steel latch sliding into place with a clean, solid click that echoed just a little longer in the quiet air, like it was making a promise I already knew was about to be tested. And for a few hours, everything held the way it was supposed to, the wind moving slow across the field, the sun climbing steady over the tree line, the kind of calm that reminds you why you bought land in the first place. But right around 9:15 I heard it. Again, not the gate this time, but the low idle of an engine sitting where it did not belong. That faint vibration carrying through the ground before the sound itself reached me. And when I stepped outside, boots pressing into dry gravel, I saw the SUV parked just outside the gate, angled slightly like it was waiting for something. And for a second nothing happened, just heat starting to rise off the dirt, and that engine humming like it had all the time in the world. Then the driver's side door opened and one of the construction workers from the development stepped out, glancing around like he was checking whether anyone was watching. And without hesitation he walked up to the gate, reached through the bars, and lifted the latch from the outside like he had done it before, like this was routine, and the metal gave way with a dull scrape that hit sharper than it should have, because that was not a mistake, that was a system. And I felt something shift again, that same cold, measured awareness settling in deeper, because what I was looking at was not just one person ignoring a boundary. It was multiple people operating under the assumption that the boundary did not apply at all. And as the SUV rolled forward, tires crunching across my driveway like it belonged there, I stepped closer, close enough that the driver finally noticed me standing there, and he slowed just slightly, giving me that uncertain nod people use when they know they might be somewhere they should not be, but are hoping confidence will carry them through anyway. And I raised a hand, not aggressive, just enough to stop the motion, and the vehicle came to a halt about 10 feet in front of me. Engine still running, heat radiating off the hood. "This is private property," I said again, same tone, same steady delivery, but this time it felt different saying it, like I was repeating something that had already been ignored too many times. And the guy shifted in his seat, glancing back toward the subdivision, then back at me. "We were told this was access," he replied, not confrontational, just matter of fact, like he was following instructions. And that was the part that confirmed it. This was being communicated, passed along, reinforced, not questioned. And I could almost see the chain of assumption stretching from that clipboard in Victoria Hale's hands all the way out to the people driving through my land without a second thought. And I stepped aside just enough to let him reverse, because this was not his fight, not really. And as the SUV backed out, gravel popping under the tires, I reached forward and pulled the gate shut again, this time letting the metal slam just a little harder than necessary, the sound ringing out across the property like a line being redrawn. And for the rest of that day I stayed aware of every sound, every distant engine, every shift in the air that did not belong. And by late afternoon I had counted 4 more attempts, different vehicles, same pattern, approach, hesitation, then either someone getting out to open the latch or simply waiting like the gate might open itself if they were patient enough. And each time it happened, the pattern became clearer, more structured, less accidental, until by the time the sun dipped low and the sky turned that deep orange that settles over Texas fields, I was no longer wondering if this would stop on its own. I knew it would not, because this was already bigger than a single conversation, bigger than a sign or a lock. This was a system that had been put in place without my permission, and systems do not disappear just because you object to them. They only stop when something stronger replaces them. And standing there with the last light fading and the gate casting a long shadow across the dirt, I realized this was no longer about asking them to respect the boundary. It was about making sure they had no way around it at all. By the next morning, I stopped thinking about it as an inconvenience and started treating it like a failure in design, because that is what it was, a system that allowed unauthorized access to continue operating despite a clear boundary. And systems like that do not fix themselves. They get reinforced unless you intervene properly. So I did what I have always done when something does not behave the way it should. I went back to the fundamentals. I walked the entire perimeter of that gate line. Just after sunrise, boots brushing through dry grass still cool from the night air, measuring distances and steps, noting angles, looking at how the land naturally guided movement. Because people follow the path of least resistance whether they realize it or not. And what I saw confirmed exactly what I had been feeling. The driveway from the subdivision lined up almost perfectly with my gate, like it had been designed that way even though it had not. And once someone opened that gate the first time, it became the obvious route, the easiest route, the one nobody questioned after that. And that is how patterns form, not through permission, but through repetition. And I knew that simply locking the gate harder was not going to change that pattern. So I made the first adjustment I could without escalating things. I installed a secondary internal barrier about 20 feet inside the gate. A heavy-duty steel crossbar anchored into the posts, something that could not be reached from the outside, something that required being on my side of the property to move. And when I tightened the final bolt into place, the metal ringing sharply under the wrench, I felt that brief, quiet satisfaction that comes with solving a problem the right way. But that feeling did not last long, because around 10:30 that same morning, I heard it again. The engine, the gravel, the pause at the gate. And I stepped outside just in time to see the latch being lifted once more. The gates swinging open with that same stubborn creak. And for a moment, everything looked exactly the same as it had the day before, until the SUV rolled forward and stopped abruptly, its front tires just inches from the crossbar I had installed, the driver hesitating, engine idling louder now in the still air, and I could see the confusion even from a distance. The way the situation no longer matched the expectation. And after a few seconds the door opened and the driver stepped out, walking up to the barrier, looking at it like it was some kind of mistake, then looking around as if the answer might be written somewhere on the land itself. And I stayed where I was, arms at my sides, letting the silence do the work, because sometimes the most effective message is the one you do not have to say out loud. And eventually he turned back, got into the vehicle, and reversed out, the gravel popping under the tires sharper this time, more abrupt, and I thought that might be enough to interrupt the pattern, at least temporarily. But by early afternoon the situation shifted again, because instead of turning around, the next vehicle that approached did not stop at the gate. It parked just outside, engine running, and within a minute I saw two people step out, walk up together, and start examining the latch, the hinges, the posts, like they were evaluating options. And that was the moment the adjustment failed, not because the barrier did not work, but because the system behind it adapted, and adaptation meant intent. It meant this was no longer passive behavior. This was something being maintained, pushed forward, justified. And I felt that same cold clarity settle in again as I watched them stand there, pointing, discussing, deciding what to do next, because that is when it became obvious. They were not trying to see if they could use the gate. They were trying to figure out how to keep using it. And that changed everything. Because once a system reaches that point, once it starts adjusting itself to overcome resistance, you are no longer dealing with a misunderstanding. You are dealing with a structure that has to be dismantled completely. And as the afternoon heat settled in and the sound of their engine finally faded away, I stood there looking at that gate, at the line it was supposed to represent, and I understood something with absolute certainty. This was not going to be solved with another lock, another sign, or another conversation, because they were not looking for access anymore. They were expecting it, and expectations like that only disappear when you remove the possibility entirely. By the third day, the pattern had evolved into something I could map almost down to the minute. Engines approaching between 7 and 9 in the morning, a lull through midday, then another wave in the late afternoon when people were heading back from work, and each time the same sequence played out. Hesitation at the gate, a pause long enough to decide, than an attempt to get through, and I stopped reacting to it emotionally and started documenting it instead, because once something becomes predictable, it also becomes measurable, and measurable problems can be dismantled piece by piece. So I set up cameras, not hidden, not disguised, just clean-mounted units along the fence line and facing the gate, capturing every approach, every attempt, every license plate. The quiet hum of the system kicking on each time motion crossed the boundary, blending into the background like it had always been there. And within 24 hours, I had something far more valuable than frustration. I had evidence, clear, time-stamped, undeniable patterns of repeated access attempts across private property. And what stood out was not just the frequency, but the confidence. Drivers did not look around anymore. They did not question whether they should be there. They assumed they belonged. And that assumption told me everything I needed to know about what was being communicated inside that subdivision. Because people do not act like that unless someone with authority has told them it is acceptable. And right on schedule, late afternoon, I heard it again. But this time it was different. Not just one engine, but two, followed by the distinct crunch of tires pulling up together outside the gate. And when I stepped out onto the porch, the heat radiating off the ground in waves, I saw her again. Victoria Hale, stepping out of her SUV with that same controlled posture, clipboard in hand. Except this time she was not alone. Another man stood beside her, mid-50s, button-down shirt, sunglasses. The kind of presence that suggested he was used to being listened to. And they did not wait for me to approach. They walked straight up to the gate, examining the crossbar I had installed like it was an inconvenience rather than a boundary. And when I reached them, the air between us felt heavier, not louder, just more deliberate. "You are obstructing established access," the man said before I could speak, his tone calm but firm, like he had delivered that sentence many times before. And I glanced at Victoria, who did not say anything at first, just watched, letting him take the lead, which told me exactly how this was structured. She enforced, he legitimized, and I let a few seconds pass before answering, letting the silence stretch just enough to make it clear I was not going to rush into their version of this conversation. "There is no established access," I said, steady, direct, and the faint hum of cicadas filled the gap that followed, and the man gave a small nod, like he had expected resistance, but not concern. "There was a verbal agreement with the previous owner," he replied, almost identical to what Victoria had said before, but delivered with the added weight of authority, and that repetition confirmed it. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a script, something they had already decided was true regardless of whether it could be proven. And I could feel the heat of the sun pressing against the back of my neck, the smell of dry grass and dust settling into the air around us, grounding the moment in something real while everything they were saying felt constructed. And I asked the same question again, because the answer matters every time. "Do you have that in writing?" And this time the response came faster, sharper. "We are in the process of formalizing it," he said, almost cutting off the space where doubt might have entered. And Victoria finally spoke, her voice smooth, controlled. "This access is important for the community, Ethan. It improves flow, reduces congestion. It is beneficial for everyone." And there it was, the shift from assumption to justification, from taking to explaining why taking was acceptable. And I looked past them for a moment, toward the subdivision, rows of houses sitting neatly in the distance, identical lines, identical driveways, all feeding into a system that relied on something they did not own. And when I looked back at them, I knew this conversation had already failed before it started, because they were not here to ask, they were here to confirm what they believed would happen next. And I felt that clarity settle in fully now, sharper than before, because this was no longer about access or convenience. This was about control over land they had decided would serve them whether I agreed or not. And as they turned to leave, confident in a resolution that had not actually occurred, I stood there listening to their engines start, watching them pull away, and I understood exactly what had just happened. They had escalated. And when someone escalates like that without legal ground, it means they are betting you will not push back hard enough to stop them. And standing there with the late afternoon sun cutting long shadows across the dirt, I made the decision that changed everything. I was not going to argue with their system anymore. I was going to replace it entirely. That night I did not sit on the porch or watch the gate like I had been doing. I went inside, shut the door, and pulled out the one thing that mattered more than anything they had said so far. The original deed, thick paper, slightly worn at the edges, the kind of document that does not care about opinions or assumptions, only facts, and I laid it out across the table under a single overhead light. The quiet hum of the air conditioner filling the room as I traced the boundary lines with my finger, reading every notation, every measurement, every clause that defined exactly where my land began and ended, because if there was even a single legitimate access agreement tied to this property, it would be there, and I read through it once, then again, slower the second time. The smell of old paper mixing with the faint scent of dust that always lingers in a place like this. And there was nothing, no easement, no right-of-way, no shared access language, nothing that even hinted at what they were claiming. And that alone told me the entire situation was built on something weaker than they wanted me to believe. But I did not stop there, because experience has taught me that what is not in your documents can sometimes show up in someone else's. So the next morning I drove into town, the early sun already heating up the pavement, and went straight to the county records office, a quiet building that smells like paper, ink, and time, where every piece of land history is filed whether people pay attention to it or not. And I spent the better part of 3 hours pulling records, tracing ownership back through the previous title holder, checking for any recorded easements that might have been attached separately, anything that could justify what Victoria and her people were doing. And again, nothing. Clean records, no filings, no amendments, no access rights granted to any adjacent property, just a straightforward transfer of ownership from one private party to another, which meant one thing very clearly: whatever understanding they were talking about did not exist in any form that could stand up to scrutiny. And as I stepped back outside into the heat, the sunlight reflecting off parked cars and making the air shimmer slightly, I felt that shift again, not frustration, not even anger, but certainty, the kind that settles in your chest when the facts line up clean and undeniable. Because now I was not dealing with a gray area, I was dealing with a clear boundary that someone else had chosen to ignore. And on the drive back, tires humming steadily against the asphalt, I started seeing the situation differently, not as a conflict, but as a design flaw in their system, because their entire access plan relied on something they did not actually have. And systems built on assumptions like that collapse the moment those assumptions are removed. And when I pulled back onto my property, the familiar crunch of gravel under my tires grounding me again, I did not go inside right away. I walked straight to the gate, running my hand along the cold steel, feeling the solid, unyielding surface under my fingers. And I looked out toward the direction of that subdivision, imagining the flow of vehicles, the routines, the habits that had formed over the past few months. All of it depended on this one point of entry. And that is when it became clear what the real leverage was. It was not the gate itself. It was the dependency they had built around it. And if I removed that dependency completely, not just interrupted it, but eliminated it, their entire system would have to reset. And standing there with the wind moving lightly across the field and the distant sound of a car approaching somewhere beyond the trees, I understood exactly what needed to happen next. Not another barrier, not another warning, but something permanent, something that did not invite discussion or interpretation, something that would turn this from a question into a fact. And for the first time since this started, I was not reacting to what they were doing. I was planning what they would not be able to undo. The next step was not about reacting anymore. It was about proving, and proving something like this does not rely on opinions or conversations. It relies on documentation, precision, and timing. So I started with the cameras, pulling the footage from the last 3 days, hours of silent recordings stitched together into something much clearer than any single moment. Every vehicle, every approach, every time someone reached through that gate like it was theirs, the soft mechanical click of the system capturing it all without interruption. And I sat there at my desk late into the evening, the glow of the screen reflecting off the glass, watching the same pattern unfold again and again until it stopped feeling random and started looking like evidence, something structured, something undeniable. And I marked timestamps, logged license plates, noted frequency. Because the difference between frustration and leverage is organization. And once I had that, I moved on to the land itself, pulling out my survey maps, detailed layouts showing every boundary line down to the inch, the angles, the setbacks, the exact placement of that gate relative to the property line, and I overlaid those with the county records I had pulled earlier, confirming again that there was no legal access granted, no shared use, nothing that could justify what was happening. And the more I looked at it, the clearer the picture became. They were not operating within a gray area, they were operating outside the system entirely, hoping no one would force them back into it. And that realization shifted everything into focus, because once you understand that, you stop trying to negotiate and start preparing to enforce. And early the next morning I made a call, not to confront, not to argue, but to confirm, a surveyor I had worked with years ago, someone who understood precision the way I did. And by mid-morning he was out there with his equipment, setting up just inside the gate, the tripod legs pressing firmly into the dirt, the faint electronic hum of his instruments cutting through the quiet as he began taking measurements, re-establishing the exact boundary line in real time, not for me, but for the record, for anything that might come next. And as he worked, I stood off to the side, arms crossed, feeling the heat already building under the Texas sun, watching as each marker was verified, each coordinate checked, until finally he gave me a small nod, the kind that says what you already knew has now been confirmed officially. And I thanked him, not with many words, just enough, because at that point words were not what mattered. And when he left, the land felt different, not physically, but in the way certainty changes how you see something, because now there was no question left anywhere in the process, not in my documents, not in the county records, not in the physical layout of the land itself. Everything aligned, everything supported the same conclusion. And later that afternoon, when the first vehicle approached again, slowing at the gate like it always did, I did not step outside. I did not say anything. I simply watched through the window as the driver hesitated, then reached for the latch out of habit, and when the gate opened just enough for the SUV to start moving forward, it stopped again at the internal barrier, the confusion returning, the pattern breaking just slightly. And that was the moment I realized something important, not just that they would keep trying, but that they were already invested in this path, invested enough to keep pushing against resistance instead of finding another route. An investment like that does not disappear quietly. It creates pressure, and pressure, if handled correctly, can be redirected. And as the SUV reversed and drove away, leaving behind nothing but the fading sound of tires on gravel, I stepped back from the window and looked at the plans I had laid out across the table, the measurements, the angles, the placement, everything calculated down to where the sun would hit it in the morning, because this was no longer about stopping access for a day or a week. This was about ending it in a way that could not be undone. And with everything now confirmed, documented, and aligned, I knew I had exactly what I needed to move forward without hesitation. By that point, I stopped looking at the situation as a conflict and started treating it like a project, because that is what it had become, a system that needed to be redesigned from the ground up. And the first step in any proper design is understanding not just your own position, but every variable connected to it. So I made another call, this time to a land use attorney I had worked with years before on a drainage dispute, someone who understood how quickly small access issues could turn into permanent legal problems if they were not handled correctly. And by early afternoon, I was sitting across from him in a quiet office that smelled faintly of coffee and paper, laying out everything I had gathered, the footage, the survey confirmations, the deed, the county records, all of it spread across the desk in a way that told the story without needing much explanation. And he took his time going through it, flipping pages slowly, occasionally pausing to look closer at a detail, and the longer he stayed quiet, the more I understood what that silence meant. Because in situations like this, hesitation usually means complexity, but this was not that. This was something else, something simpler. And when he finally leaned back in his chair, he gave a small nod, the kind that confirms what you already suspected. There is no easement here, he said plainly, and hearing it out loud did not change the facts, but it solidified them in a different way, like the difference between knowing something and having it confirmed by someone whose entire job is to understand the consequences of it. And he went on to explain what I had already begun to piece together on my own, that if I allowed this access to continue long enough without formally challenging it, they could eventually attempt to claim a prescriptive easement, essentially turning repeated unauthorized use into a legal argument over time. And that was the part that mattered most, not what they were doing now, but what they might try to turn it into later. And I felt that clarity sharpen even further, because now the timeline mattered just as much as the boundary, and I asked him the only question that really counted at that stage. If I close it off completely, within my property line, with proper documentation, can they challenge it? And he shook his head slightly. Not if everything is built and recorded correctly, he replied. And there it was, the confirmation I needed, not just that I was right, but that I could act without opening myself up to something bigger down the line. And as I gathered the documents back into a neat stack, the quiet rustle of paper filling the space between us, I realized something important. This was no longer reactive. This was controlled, planned, structured. And when I stepped back outside into the late afternoon heat, the sunlight reflecting off the pavement and making the air shimmer, I felt that shift fully settle in, because now I was not dealing with uncertainty at all. I was operating within a defined system that I understood better than they did. And on the drive back, the steady hum of tires against asphalt almost faded into the background as my mind moved ahead, laying out steps, sequencing actions, calculating timing. Because once you know the boundaries and the legal ground beneath them, the rest becomes execution. And when I pulled onto my property again, the familiar crunch of gravel under my truck grounding everything back into place, I did not go to the house. I went straight to the gate, standing there for a moment, looking at it not as a barrier, but as a starting point, the place where their system ended and mine would begin. And in the distance I could already hear another vehicle approaching, that low, familiar engine sound carrying across the land like it had every right to be there. But this time I did not move to intercept it. I did not step forward or raise a hand. I simply stood there, still and quiet, because for the first time since this started, I was not preparing to respond to what they were about to do. I was preparing to make sure it would not matter anymore. The plan did not start with concrete or steel. It started with timing, because timing is what separates a reaction from a move. And I knew if I was going to do this right, it had to happen all at once, not in pieces, not in stages that could be interrupted or questioned. So I spent the next 48 hours finalizing everything down to the smallest detail, calling in a crew I trusted, not from the area, not connected to anything local, just professionals who show up, do the job, and leave without asking unnecessary questions. And when I walked them through the site just after sunrise, the air still carrying that faint cool edge before the heat set in, I could see it in their expressions. They understood immediately that this was not decorative work, this was structural, intentional, and permanent. And I laid out the measurements clearly. The exact line of the boundary confirmed by the survey, the height, the depth, the reinforcement, everything calculated not just to stand, but to remove any ambiguity about where access ended. And as the equipment rolled in, engines rumbling low across the land, the smell of diesel mixing with dust as tires pressed into the dirt, I felt that shift again, the one that happens when planning turns into execution, because once the first mark is made, there is no going back to discussion, and the crew moved efficiently, measuring, marking, setting forms, the steady rhythm of tools and machinery replacing the quiet that had been there before, and I stayed just off to the side, watching, not intervening, because this part had to unfold exactly as designed, and by mid-morning the outline was already visible, a solid, unmistakable line cutting across the space just inside the gate, not blocking randomly, but placed with precision where it could not be bypassed without crossing deeper into the property. And that detail mattered, because this was not just about stopping vehicles. It was about reinforcing the boundary itself, making it physically and visually undeniable. And right on schedule, just after 10, I heard it again, that familiar approach, the engine, the slight slowdown as the vehicle reached the gate. And I did not have to look to know who it was, because some patterns become predictable in more ways than one. And when I did turn, I saw her SUV pull up, stopping just outside the open gate. And for a moment she did not move, just sat there, taking in the scene, the crew, the equipment, the structure already taking shape. And then the door opened, and Victoria stepped out, the gravel shifting under her heels as she walked forward, slower. This time, more deliberate, her eyes moving from the workers to the forming barrier, and then finally to me. And for the first time since this started, that controlled expression on her face was not entirely steady. There was something else there now, something closer to calculation, like she was trying to understand what part of this she could still influence. And she stopped a few feet from the line we had marked, just far enough to avoid stepping onto the active work area, and her voice, when she spoke, was still composed, but tighter than before. "What exactly are you doing?" she asked, and I let a second pass before answering. Not because I needed time, but because clarity lands better when it is not rushed. "I am building on my property," I said, simple, direct, and the sound of a metal form being set into place rang out behind me, sharp and final, and she glanced toward it, then back at me. "This will disrupt access," she replied, and there it was again, that assumption, that the system she had been operating was something that deserved to continue. And I could feel the weight of everything I had confirmed over the past few days settle into that moment. Every document, every measurement, every recorded attempt, all of it aligning behind a single point, and I held her gaze, steady, unmoved. "There is no access to disrupt," I said, and for the first time, she did not have an immediate response. Just a brief pause where the reality of the situation had nowhere to go. But straight through, and around us the work continued, steady, methodical, the structure rising inch by inch, turning what had once been an open path into something else entirely, something final. And as she stood there, looking at it, I knew this was the moment where everything shifted, not because of what had already been built, but because of what could no longer be undone. By late afternoon, the structure had already taken shape in a way that could not be mistaken for anything temporary. The clean vertical lines of reinforced panels rising from the ground with a kind of quiet certainty, each section locking into the next with that solid, final sound that carries farther than you expect across open land. And the difference in the air was immediate, not just in what you could see, but in what you could feel, because where there had once been an open path, there was now a defined edge, something that did not invite interpretation or negotiation, just presence. And I stood a few yards back from it, the heat of the day still radiating off the dirt, watching as the crew secured the last anchors into place, tightening everything down until there was no movement left, no give, no question about what it was designed to do. And behind me I heard it again, another vehicle approaching, then another, the familiar pattern still trying to play itself out. Engines slowing, tires shifting on gravel as drivers reached the gate expecting the same sequence to unfold. But this time it did not, because even though the gate still stood where it always had, open just enough to allow visibility, the space beyond it had changed completely, and I watched as the first SUV rolled forward cautiously, then stopped, the driver leaning slightly over the wheel, trying to process what they were seeing, the line that now cut across the path they had been using for weeks. And for a few seconds nothing happened, just the low idle of the engine and the faint ticking sound as heat moved through metal, and then the vehicle reversed slowly, backing away from something it could not pass. And that moment repeated itself again and again over the next hour. Different drivers, same reaction, hesitation, confusion, then retreat, and with each one the pattern that had been built over time unraveled just a little more, because habits depend on consistency. And once that consistency breaks, people stop trusting the path, and that is when systems collapse. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Victoria returned, not alone this time, but with two other residents, all of them standing just outside the gate, looking in, their attention fixed on the structure now fully in place. And there was no clipboard this time, no rehearsed explanation, just a quiet kind of realization settling over the group as they took in what had changed. And I walked up slowly, not rushing, not posturing, just present, because there was nothing left to argue. And she turned toward me, her expression controlled but thinner now, like something had been stripped away that she could not replace. "You cannot just shut down access like this," she said, and her voice still held that same tone, but it lacked the certainty it had before, and I could hear the distant hum of another car turning away behind her, choosing a different route without even attempting the gate. And I let that sound sit between us for a moment before answering. "It was never access to begin with," I said, and this time there was no immediate reply, just a brief exchange of glances between her and the others, the kind that happens when the situation no longer fits the explanation you have been repeating. And one of the residents shifted his weight slightly, gravel crunching under his shoes, looking at the structure again like he was recalculating something, not emotionally, but practically, the way people do when they realize a route they depended on no longer exists. And Victoria looked back at me, her posture still straight, but the edge of control now replaced with something more measured. "This is going to cause problems for the neighborhood," she said, and I nodded once, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement of what she was really saying, because the problem had never been mine. It had just been redirected, and as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, the structure stood exactly where it was supposed to, unchanging, unaffected by the conversations happening around it. And I realized in that moment that this was the difference between what they had been doing and what I had built. They were relying on assumption, repetition, and pressure, and I had replaced all of that with something fixed, something grounded in fact and design, something that did not require enforcement because it enforced itself. And as more cars approached and then turned away without stopping, the sound of engines fading in the distance, I knew the shift was complete, not because they accepted it, but because they had no way around it anymore. The next morning the land felt different in a way that had nothing to do with the structure itself and everything to do with what was no longer happening. There was no engine noise cutting across the early air, no hesitation at the gate, no pause followed by the familiar scrape of metal being pushed open, just wind moving steady through the grass and the distant sound of a single truck passing on the main road far beyond the property line, and I stood there with a cup of coffee in my hand, the warmth settling into my fingers as I looked out over the same stretch of ground that had felt contested just days before, now quiet, settled, back to what it was supposed to be, and that silence carried more weight than any argument ever could, because it meant the system they had been relying on was gone, not interrupted, not delayed, but removed entirely. And later that morning I drove into town. Again, not out of necessity this time, but to complete the last step of the process, filing the updated survey confirmation and construction documentation with the county, making the boundary not just physical but recorded, something that would exist in every official reference moving forward. And the office was the same as before: cool air, the faint smell of paper and ink, the quiet rhythm of people handling documents that define ownership in ways most never think about. And as I handed everything over, I felt that final layer settle into place, because now there was no version of this situation that could be interpreted differently, not by the HOA, not by a lawyer, not by anyone looking at the records. And when I stepped back outside, the sunlight already bright against the pavement, I knew there was nothing left to prepare for, only to observe how things adjusted. And it did not take long. By early afternoon, the ripple effects were already visible. Vehicles from the subdivision no longer even slowed near my gate. They stayed on their own streets, rerouted through the access points they actually owned. And that small shift in behavior said more than any conversation ever had, because people adapt quickly when a shortcut disappears, especially when there is no longer any question about whether it will come back. And later that day I saw Victoria again, not at the gate this time, but farther down the road, standing with a small group near the entrance to the subdivision, their posture different now, less certain, more contained, like the space they operated in had narrowed. And when she noticed me, there was no approach, no attempt to restart the conversation, just a brief glance that held for a second longer than necessary before she turned back to the group. And that was enough, because it told me everything had shifted on their side as well. The authority she had been projecting no longer extended beyond what could actually be enforced, and that is where it always should have been. And as the afternoon stretched into evening, the lights softening over the fields and the air cooling just enough to carry that familiar scent of dust and grass again, I walked back out to the gate one more time, not to check it, not to reinforce it, but simply to stand there and take in the space. As it was now, unchanged in its purpose but restored in its function, and I rested a hand briefly against the steel, feeling the solid, unmoving surface beneath my palm, knowing that everything behind it was exactly as it should be, not because someone allowed it, but because it was defined clearly, built correctly, and protected without compromise. And as the last light faded and the land settled into quiet once again, I realized that what had been taken was not just access, it was assumption. And without that, the entire situation resolved itself without another word. It has been a few weeks now, and the rhythm of the place has settled back into something that feels honest again, the kind of quiet that is not fragile or temporary, but earned, the kind that does not get interrupted by engines that do not belong or footsteps that were never invited. And every morning when I step out onto that porch, coffee in hand. I hear exactly what I heard the first day I moved here. Wind moving through the grass, the distant call of birds, the soft crunch of gravel under my own boots and no one else's, and the gate stands where it always did, unchanged in appearance but completely different in meaning, because now it is not just a boundary, it is a statement, a line that has been tested and held, and beyond it the structure I built does exactly what it was designed to do, not loudly, not aggressively, but absolutely. And what surprised me most was not how quickly everything stopped, but how quickly everyone adjusted, because within days the traffic patterns shifted entirely. The subdivision rerouted itself through its own roads. New signage appeared near their entrance directing residents along the proper route, and whatever internal conversations happened over there stayed over there, exactly where they should have been from the beginning. And I only saw Victoria once more after that, briefly, passing by on the main road, her SUV moving at a steady pace without slowing, without turning, without even glancing toward the gate. And that told me more than any conversation ever could, because when someone stops pushing, it means they have run out of ground to stand on. And that is not something you argue. That is something you build, and every now and then I walk down to that line, not to check it, not to maintain it, but just to stand there for a moment and look at it the way I look at any project that is done right, clean, precise, exactly where it needs to be, doing exactly what it was meant to do without needing attention or explanation. And there is a certain kind of satisfaction in that, not loud, not dramatic, just steady, the kind that settles in quietly and stays there. Because in the end, this was never about blocking a road or winning an argument. It was about restoring something that should never have been questioned in the first place. And as the sun sets over the land, casting that long, familiar glow across the field and turning everything a deep shade of gold, I can feel it again, that sense of control, not over anyone else, but over what is mine. And that is the difference people forget. You do not have to fight for control when you understand where it begins and where it ends. You just have to build it in a way that cannot be ignored. Because boundaries do not need to be loud to be respected, they just need to be real.